For almost 500 years, the Roman Republic seemed unbeatable. It was this incredible model of shared power, law, and order. But then, in its final century, the whole thing just tore itself apart. It was a storm of violence, pure ambition, and political chaos that would, no joke, change the course of Western history forever. So today, let's conduct a kind of political autopsy on this fallen giant.
From about 88 BC to 31 BC, this was Roman politics. Assassination, bribery, straight-up gang warfare in the streets, and of course, civil war. The very system that was designed to stop any one person from becoming a king was now creating one would-be tyrant after another. It was a vicious cycle, and Rome just couldn't seem to break free.
The Roman historian Sallust, who actually lived through all of this chaos, thought he knew what was wrong. He believed the Republic was sick, and the disease was a total collapse of morality, a lust for money, a lust for power. He argued this is what had corrupted Rome's very soul. But you have to wonder, was it really that simple? And that gets us to the absolute heart of our investigation today. This deep, bitter political rivalry between two groups, the Optimates and the Populares. Was that the disease that killed the Republic, or was it just a symptom of a much, much deeper illness? To figure that out, we've got to understand who these guys were and what they were fighting about.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll define the key players in this political breakdown. Then we'll see how their rivalry exploded into actual violence. After that, we'll dig into whether there were deeper cracks in the foundation of the Republic. And finally, we'll deliver our verdict on what really brought Rome to its knees.
All right, let's set the stage for this political drama. Now, it's really important to get this. Rome did not have political parties like we think of them today. Instead, their politics were dominated by two opposing philosophies, two different ways of doing things inside the Senate itself.
Okay, so on one side you had the Optimates, which translates to the best men. You can think of them as the conservatives, the traditionalists. They believed power belonged with the Senate, period. They wanted to stick to the old ways. Then you had the populares, or favoring the people. Now don't get it twisted, these guys were often just as rich and aristocratic as the Optimates, but their whole strategy was to go around the Senate and use the people's assemblies to get things done. They'd propose popular reforms to win over the masses, which, of course, also gave them a ton of personal power.
And hey, don't just take my word for it. Here's Cicero, a man who had to navigate this political minefield himself. He basically says the split wasn't about being in a certain party, it was about your political style. Who were you trying to please? The established elite? Or were you trying to fire up the crowds in the forum? Getting this distinction is absolutely crucial to understanding everything that happens next.
So you have these two different approaches to politics. But this disagreement, well, it didn't stay a polite debate for long. It became the excuse for unbelievable violence. This was a rivalry that was literally written in blood, and it would end up shattering every single one of Rome's political rules.
And just look at how quickly things escalated. In 88 BC, the Optimate general Sulla does something that was completely unthinkable. For the first time in Roman history, a Roman general marches his own army on Rome to settle a political fight. I mean, that one act just broke a sacred taboo. It opened a Pandora's box of violence that led to conspiracies, shady backroom deals, and, eventually, to Caesar crossing the Rubicon and starting the final fatal civil war.
The historian Plutarch really hits the nail on the head. He points to that personal, bitter hatred between Marius, the Populares leader, and Sulla, the Optimate, as the real turning point. After they did what they did, using an army to get your way in politics was no longer off limits. It was a real and terrifying option. The Republic was never, ever going to be the same.
But this brings us right back to our main question. Was this insane political rivalry the actual cause of the collapse? Or was the whole Optimate versus Populares conflict just the fever breaking on a republic that was already dying from other diseases? So if we start to peel back the layers, we can see at least three other critical problems. First, that pure, unchecked ambition that Sallust was so worried about. Second, a massive crisis in military loyalty that basically turned the republic's own armies against it. And third, just crippling economic inequality. The gap between the super rich and the desperate poor was huge, and it created a population that was angry and ready to follow any strongman who promised them a better life.
This military reform by Gaius Marius, it was a complete game changer. See, before him, soldiers had to own land, which meant their loyalty was tied to the state of Rome itself. But Marius opened up the army to the poorest, landless citizens. And suddenly, a soldier's entire life, his pay, his gear, his retirement bonus of land, it all came directly from his general. So who were they loyal to? Not Rome. They were loyal to their commander. And that created these incredibly powerful private armies that ambitious men could use like personal weapons.
And that need for land was a wound that had been festering for a long time. Decades before our story even starts, two brothers, the Gracchi, tried to fix this massive inequality with land reform. And what was the Senate's response? They had them hunted down and clubbed to death in the street. Now that sends a pretty clear and chilling message, right? It told everyone that the system would not bend peacefully. It can only be broken by force. That legacy of violence poisoned Roman politics for generations to come.
This bit from a speech by Cicero perfectly captures how the Optimates saw things. He's arguing against the land bill, and he's basically accusing these popularist politicians of being frauds. He sees their proposals not as real reform, but as cynical power grabs. They're just dangling the promise of free stuff to win votes, he says, even if it bankrupts the state, all for their own personal gain. You can see how economic desperation became political fuel. So, where does all this leave us? We've got this toxic political rivalry, we have ambitious generals with their own private armies, and a society that's totally fractured by inequality. How do all these pieces of the puzzle fit together to explain the final, bloody collapse of the Republic?
Well, the collapse wasn't really a single event. It was more like a three-step catastrophe. First, you have the systemic flaws. The private armies, the massive inequality. These were the deep cracks in the foundation that made the whole system unstable. Second, you have the political battlefield. The Optimati versus Populares rivalry gave everyone a team to root for, a flag to wave. It provided the framework for the conflict. And finally, step 3, the catalysts. This was a generation of incredibly ambitious men who used both the system's flaws and the political divide as weapons to try and grab ultimate power for themselves.
So in the end, the rivalry between the Optimates and Populares wasn't the root cause. Think of it this way, it was the script for destruction. It gave everyone their lines and their motivations. But the real destructive force, that came from the actors, the powerful generals with their loyal armies who had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to bring the whole house down.
And that leaves us with one final, kind of haunting question. After decades of nonstop civil war and the complete breakdown of politics, maybe the Republic was just beyond saving. You have to wonder, was the rise of an emperor not actually the death of Rome, but maybe the only way to end the chaos and save Rome from itself?